In this lesson, we will be covering your first type of instrument procedure, instrument departures. Our goal here is to get you familiar with how to read both the graphic and text departure procedures, or DPs. We will also introduce you to techniques for staying on procedure in flight. You can find current charts online, but most students are using ForeFlight nowadays, and it has them built in. All you have to do is make sure that you have downloaded the most recent ones. If you want to access standard instrument departures, or SIDs, online, there are a couple of ways to do it. One is SkyVector, which will have them available if you right-click on an airport. I'll also put the link to the FAA site where you can search for them in D2L. You can also download the takeoff minimum section of the plates so that you can look up the non-graphical DPs. AirNav also has them to download. It's always your responsibility to make sure that you have the current one when you download them. Jeppesen charts are the standard for most airline professionals, and although their symbols and layouts are similar to the government versions, they have a few differences that take some study. In our course, we will use only the NACO plates, but you're welcome to download Jet plates on your own for additional study at your own cost. Your IFR written exam will be exclusively on the NACO chart symbology. Regardless of where you get them, you'll hear them referred to as terps or plates quite often. Departure procedures come in a couple of types and formats, so let's start with that. There are two main types of departure procedures out there: obstacle departure procedures and standard instrument departures. On a basic level, an ODP makes sure that you won't hit anything when you depart, and a SID eases ATC workload. Let's look at why some airports have these procedures created for them and some don't. The moment someone designs an approach to an airport, we also have to decide if we need to make a departure procedure for it. If an aircraft can turn in any direction from a runway within limits of the assessment area and remain clear of obstacles, that runway passes what's called a diverse departure assessment, and no ODP is published. Although it's possible we may still make a SID in order to help relieve air traffic control workload. As they look at the assessment area, the assumption is that you cross the departure end of the runway at 35 feet and can climb at 200 feet per nautical mile. Note that this and other climb gradients are given in feet per nautical mile, not feet per minute. This is to allow for a variety of aircraft and ground speeds. It's worth taking a few moments at this point to calculate what your aircraft's climb gradient is at a couple of different elevations, so you have some context. It's usually not a problem to maintain 200 feet per nautical mile at lower altitudes, but many ODPs and SIDs require more than that. Your TERPs give you a handy table at the back of the binder to determine how many feet per minute you need to climb in order to meet the feet per nautical mile requirement. Simple math can do the same thing though. No matter when it happens, if something's in your airplane breaks, you're having a bad day. But probably one of the worst times for a problem to arise would be while taking off IMC. In that moment, your only options may be to turn back to your departure airport or try to fly a broken airplane in IMC to your nearest alternate. If the weather at your departure airport were below the landing minimums for your airport, you wouldn't be able to return and would be forced to continue the flight, for better or worse. Back in the day, landing minimums for commercial operators were usually lower than the takeoff minimums for that reason. Additionally, all takeoff minimums once included a ceiling as well as visibility requirements. Today, takeoff minimums are typically lower than landing minimums, and ceiling requirements are only included if it's necessary to see and avoid obstacles in the departure area. You can find takeoff minimums on the same page as your departure procedure or on the SID. If standard minimums apply, then it will just say standard. So you need to memorize these if you're going to operate under 135 or 121, or if you're going to commit to these minimums for yourself. For aircraft like ours, the minimum weather is just 1 mile visibility and no ceiling. As you can see, for Hillsboro, the minimums are on the Farmington 7 SID and on the departure procedure in the takeoff minimum section of the plates. Since there are non-standard takeoff minimums, the T on the black triangle is marked on the approach plates to get your attention. You just need to flip to the section of your terps that has the same symbol in the corner of each page and look for your airport, which is listed alphabetically. If you're using ForeFlight, make sure you learn how to get to this page quickly and easily. We'll talk first about obstacle departure procedures. These are considered the default IFR procedure for a given runway and are intended for pilot awareness and use in the absence of ATC radar vectors or standard instrument departure assignments. They can also be used by VFR pilots when departing at night or in marginal conditions. The primary purpose of an ODP is for obstacle obstruction clearance. They use the least restrictive route of flight to the en route structure. Only one ODP will be established for each of the runways on the airport. This is what it is assumed you're going to do if you're not given a clearance of some other sort for takeoff. ODPs always have the word obstacle in the title. There may be graphical representations like this one, or it may be just described in a textual format along with the takeoff minimums in the minimums section of your terps. Standard instrument departures, or SIDs, not only clear you of obstacles, but also help with the flow of traffic and put you onto the en route structure more efficiently. Designed by ATC for busy areas, they increase the capacity of terminal airspace and control the flow of traffic with minimal communication. They also reduce environmental impact through noise abatement procedures. For us, as pilots, it simplifies departure clearances and is always charted graphically. These require an IFR clearance from ATC to fly them. You can request the one you want by filing for it. You'll choose based on the direction you're headed and what airway you want to fly. They can always change it up on you though, so be prepared. I've had them change the SID while I was already lined up on the runway waiting for takeoff. Be prepared to either switch SIDs quickly if you're familiar with them, or reject the clearance. In addition to the graphic depiction, there is also a textual description on each plate. It is very important to read this text. There are often steps on it, such as an altitude you must reach before making a turn, that you'll miss if you just look at the pictures. Some SIDs may rely on vectors. ATC provides radar vectors from just after takeoff until reaching the assigned route, or as depicted on the SID chart. You are expected to climb to 400 feet above the departure end of the runway, or DER elevation, before making the initial turn. Radar SIDs do not include departure routes or transition routes because independent pilot navigation is not involved. The procedure sets forth an initial departure instruction that typically includes an initial heading and altitude. ATC expects you to immediately comply with radar vectors and notify them if you're unable. Like all TERP plates, information is presented in a standard way that allows the pilots to find information quickly. The best way to become familiar with this format is to look at a lot of SIDs. Pause the video for a moment and look at the highlighted areas on this SID. Some SIDs are 2 pages long, like this one, but most will fit on a single page. You just need to do a quick check and make sure there's not a note about the page number. This is a Pilot Nav SID. It also happens to be an RNAV SID. It uses GPS waypoints instead of having a VOR for the transition. There are a wide variety of Pilot Nav SIDs out there. RNAV means your aircraft must be equipped with specific equipment and performance standards in order for you to fly the RNAV SID. If you don't have an IFR GPS, then you have to have DME IRU, which requires 2 DME units and an inertial reference unit that must also meet RNAV1 standards, which require a total system error of no more than 1 nautical mile for 95% of the time. It's unlikely you'll be flying something with one of those units in it for the first part of your career anyway. As you depart, you must engage the RNAV equipment no later than 500 feet above the airport, and you must use a CDI or flight director or an autopilot in lateral navigation mode. When you file a SID, you can use the SID name if it's in this format, with the period followed by the transition you want to use. In this case, there were 3 choices: Easton, Eugene VOR, or Harper. You indicate which one you plan to use by filing bernie2.eason, and if it works with the traffic that is there at the time, ATC will give it to you. Once again, you can find information in a similar format on each SID so that you can locate it quickly. In this case, there's a list of valid transitions that you could file near the bottom with the exact format that will be accepted in the system when you file. If you don't file using a SID, you may still get one assigned to you when you pick up your clearance. If you cannot fly a SID from a certain airport or for some reason prefer not to, you can let ATC know ahead of time by writing no SIDs in the remarks section of your IFR flight plan. You can also just tell ATC over the radio that you want to decline a SID. However, that could lead to a flight delay, so it's better to let them know ahead of time if you can. Usually, SIDs make our lives easier though. This is especially true when you're using an IFR GPS, which will have the SID in its database, so you can select it and complete with the transition prior to takeoff. If it's VMC conditions, you may want to depart the airport VFR and pick up your IFR clearance while airborne in the en route environment. This option can be helpful at busy airports when a long delay could be encountered if you want to wait for an IFR clearance, or if the airport's only available DP or ODP takes you in the wrong direction and you would rather fly directly to your route. It also works well at smaller airports where no DP or instrument approaches exist. The departure procedure is an important piece of your plan and may have impacts on the rest of your flight, so make sure you think it through. Think about the obstacles that are in the area, think about your aircraft performance, the required equipment in order to follow the SID, your ability, are you current in the types of navigation that are going to be required, what kind of weather and visibility you have, the direction you're going, and fuel requirements, as some SIDs will add a little bit of time to your flight. Picking up your clearance is sometimes one of the trickiest parts of the flight. We have it easy at Hillsborough and Troutdale. All we have to do is call ground and they give us the clearance before we taxi. Bigger airports have a separate clearance delivery frequency. Smaller ones are harder because you need to get the clearance through air traffic control. This is important to distinguish between the clearance, which you can think of as the information, and the release, which is when the clearance becomes activated. You may pick up a clearance from ground or a clearance delivery or even the phone and then spend a half hour waiting for takeoff. They don't hold the airspace open that whole time. If you're at a towered airport, the tower talks with an approach on a landline to get your release before they give you a clearance for takeoff. It's important to continue to increase your fluency in the chart symbology. You are not always going to have time to look up things in the legend. Before using any chart, it's vitally important to make sure that it's current. The revision date is given in Julian, which may be unfamiliar to you. The first two digits in a Julian date are the year, and the last three indicate the day of the year. It will begin with 1, obviously, and go to 365 or 366 if it's a leap year. There are also amendment numbers and dates to help you verify you're looking at the current one. If there are two pilots, they should always cross-check these. On the SIDS, you'll find them here at the top and the bottom of the plate. As you encounter new symbols, make it a habit of looking them up immediately. If possible, make a note on the plate so you can come back and review it later. Chances are you'll learn and then forget and have to relearn these symbols several times, but each time it will be firmer in your mind and you'll start to notice tiny variations that may mean something. Note how much information is packed into just the NavAid information on the Farmington SID, including which en route charts the SID is located on, both high and low. It also contains the NavAid name and frequency, the lat long, the ID in both letters and Morse code. This may seem superfluous when you're just practicing out of Hillsborough, but later you may be in half a dozen states in just one day, and these little details can be real time savers as you try to find your location on low altitude en route charts. SIDS often have a top altitude that you're not to exceed without further clearance, though it may indicate at the top of the altitude that it's simply going to be assigned, as it is here. Small details, such as whether there is a line above or below an altitude or airspeed, can change the exact meaning. For instances such as these, you can picture your aircraft superimposed. The lines represents barriers to your operation. In this example, you can't go above or below 5,500 feet or above or below 175 knots. Those are mandatory altitudes and airspeeds. Here, you can't go below 2,500 feet or below 120 knots. Here, the altitude and airspeeds are a ceiling that you can't go above or past. There can be blocks of approved altitudes for certain purposes, or recommended ones which have no lines. There's no way you could stay awake through a video where I simply read through all the symbols and tell them to you. The best way to learn the symbols is to use the chart, and that's the basis of your homework on SIDS. Make sure you watch the 5 T's video and read your homework assignment. You need to submit the assignment and be ready to talk to us about it in class. I'll cover a couple of common misconceptions really quickly though before we move on from symbology. When you see compulsory and non-compulsory in relation to a fix, What they're talking about is whether or not it is a required reporting point. This only applies to non-radar operations where they are relying on your reports to keep track of your location. In radar contact, they can see you, so you can ignore these and just report the few things that we're always required to report, such as entering or leaving a hold. And we covered those in regulations if you need to review those. It's also really important to understand the difference between a radial being used to define a fix or a point where you should begin a turn and a procedure track. When you see lines like this where there is an R, an LR, or an LB before the number, those are simply used to define something. They're not necessarily a track that you follow. If it's a legitimate track for you to follow, whether it's a part of the actual procedure or a feeder route, there will be a course embedded in the arrow, but without the R or the LR or the LB. And there'll usually be an altitude, a minimum altitude that's next to it, along with other notes, such as whether a procedure turn is allowed, and so forth. Here's an example right on our Hillsboro Scapa 06 departure. We have a radial, the 250 radial off of Battleground up here, that helps define Scapa intersection. We have a radial off of Newburgh, here the 334, that helps define the track that we're going to fly, but it is not part of the track on the thinner part of the line down here. And then finally we have the actual track for the procedure here. And for this procedure, we're taking off and intercepting that track as part of the procedure. There's a separate video on the 5Ts, which is a tool pilots use to avoid forgetting things as they move through departures. We're also going to use this for all the homework for the rest of the term, so make sure that you watch that video after you're done with this one.